Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how the Tory mythos which sprung up around Boris Johnson has shifted the Conservatives' anchors to reality and is steering them wrong even now. When people say that the Tories have learned nothing from their election defeat, it's not just a political line used by their opponents, it is true on multiple levels. But first, for daily political commentary, please click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So I was reading an article in the Huffington Post from the point of view of some in Labour and some in the Conservatives about the political prowess, or maybe lack of it, of Kemi Badenoch. At one point, one of the Badenoch supporters points out that it's a strength to not have full detailed policies yet because we don't know what the world is going to look like in 4 years. Now, as I've said before, this is true to an extent. And you almost feel like Badenoch is trying to learn from what Starmer did, where Labour had very few nailed down policies for the first couple of years of his leadership of Labour. However, if this is Badenoch's thinking, it's a bit clumsy. Yes, there are a lot of unknowns about where we will be in 4 years' time, but there are some knowns. Labour did have some policies in the early days of Starmer. Some of them changed, but they could explain that due to those unforeseen events. But where Badenoch is making novice mistakes here is a lack of understanding of the way to apply this broadly correct thinking. First, she has challenged Starmer to call a general election immediately. She said that this Wednesday. We're ready, she said. Well, if she insists she's ready for an election in the new year, where are her policies? You cannot at the same time claim that you have 4 years to work on your policies and insist that you want a general election in 2 months' time. That's proper Schrodinger's politics thinking there. It looks ridiculous. The other thing is that until Badenoch has definite policies, she's presenting no alternative to Labour. The only votes she can possibly harvest are those dissatisfied with Labour, and those are as likely to go to the other opposition parties, the Conservatives. Now, if, as this supporter of Badenoch claims, she's got like 4 years to sort it out, okay, you can go along with that, that's fine. But has she? There are Tory MPs who are circling like vultures, and they're not willing to give her more than a year and a half or 2 years if she doesn't shape up. You know, Badenoch is doing nothing to attract votes right now. She's just catching ones falling from Labour. But Labour are in the phase now of unpopular implementation, because implementation of a policy is always unpopular. If, as they hope and expect, the policies come good in terms of the lower NHS waiting list and crime figures which Starmer is pushing right now, which I'll discuss later today, as well as progress on housing and energy and transport, then the Tories will lose those votes again because they didn't really do anything to attract them in the first place. But what's this got to do with Boris Johnson? Well, the same person who was defending Badenoch's lack of policies made a point, and this is where I think they went badly wrong. They said, well, look, 4 years ago, nobody predicted that Labour would win a majority. 4 years ago, people were talking about Boris Johnson being Prime Minister for 10 years. Both of these statements are powerfully wrong. First, sure, lots of people did not predict a Labour majority. I certainly didn't. I didn't see how it was going to happen. But some senior members of Labour did. And it wasn't just a show of confidence. They had good reasons to think it. Emily Thornberry wrote a piece just after the 2019 election about how history showed that the Tory win was fragile and could easily be blown away. She wasn't just right about the result, but how it panned out. But the second statement about people talking about Johnson being Prime Minister for 10 years, that was completely deluded. Boris Johnson was saying it, nobody else was. I had made it clear that Boris Johnson would not lead the Tories into the next election. And I said so straight after the 2019 election. And I wasn't guessing any more than Thornberry was. First of all, cast your minds back to the circumstances which made Boris Johnson Conservative leader. And we sort of have to go right back to 2016. Boris Johnson seems to have never liked the EU. But he was what you would call a pragmatic Remainer. He'd rather the EU didn't exist, but given that it did, the UK should absolutely be a part of it. He was unequivocal about that for years. He famously wrote 2 comment pieces, one arguing for us to remain in the EU, one arguing for leaving it. He wrote 2 because he had no intention of writing what he genuinely believed, only what he thought was the most strategically useful in helping him win his ultimate ambition of becoming Prime Minister. Was it better to be amongst the Eurosceptics or amongst the Remainers? Moderate Tory MPs, who were much more likely to be Remainers, didn't have much respect for Johnson. So he thought his best source of parliamentary support for a leadership bid would come from the hard Eurosceptic fringe, the likes of the ERG. So he submitted the article calling to leave the EU, and persuaded by Michael Gove, acted as the presentation puppet for Dominic Cummings's Leave campaign. However, when David Cameron ran away, squealing like one of his pigs, Boris Johnson thought it had all worked out and he was going to take over. Then Michael Gove stabbed him in the back and left the way open for Theresa May to take over unchallenged. But it didn't work. The Tories were divided between those who wanted the hardest possible Brexit, which was not mentioned in the referendum campaign, and those who wanted the softest possible Brexit, because if you're going to do something stupid, at least do it in the least stupid way. Like if you're going to jump off a cliff because someone tells you can fly, at least tie a pillow around your head. May tried to resolve this with an election to boost her numbers, but it went disastrously wrong. She lost what little majority Cameron had left her before running off to France to be well clear of the blast zone. May tried compromises, but there is no compromising with extremists, so suffered historic government defeats and votes on the withdrawal agreement. So the Tories were now stuck. The setup of the Parliament at the time was never going to leave the EU in the way the hard Brexit wing of the Tory party wanted. But if they didn't leave under these harsh terms, then the Brexit wing of the Tory party was going to split the Tory party. The only way to resolve it was a second referendum on the terms of exit, with Remain as an option. And this is what was going to happen if we didn't have that 2019 general election. But this was no good for the Tories. Like I say, even some of those who wanted to remain, it would have split their party and allowed in the feared Jeremy Corbyn. Their only realistic option from their point of view was a rejig of Parliament. There had to be a complete reset of MPs in favour of the hard Brexit. Now that meant a general election. It was the only way to save their party, or so they thought. So they needed that election. Only problem was Theresa May could not possibly win a decent majority. She was even more unpopular than when she failed in 2017. But the rest of the alternatives were about as appealing as a bucket of sludge as well. So they turned to Boris Johnson. They didn't think he would be a good leader, and certainly not a good prime minister. But they thought he could win an election, get Brexit done, and then the Tory party would finally be able to live together in peace and harmony. That was why Johnson became their leader, to win one election, to get us out of the EU under the terms that would be acceptable to the swivel-eyed loons, unite the Conservative Party against Labour. That was it. That was his one job. No matter what happened afterwards, once Johnson had delivered his election win and dealt with Brexit, his usefulness ceased. There was no way he was going to be allowed to continue beyond the point at which we'd left the EU, the single market and the customs union. You know, his cards were marked from the end of 2020. He was not going to be Prime Minister for 10 years. Even by Tory standards, he was a fraud. I was only surprised he lasted as long as he did. But thinking back, I think his greater longevity was down to three factors. First, the vaccine bounce of early 2021. That eased the pressure on him. Obviously, Tory MPs aren't going to get rid of a leader while the party is riding high in the polls. Why would you? Second, he'd been a bit more ruthless than anticipated and rammed the Conservative benches and his cabinet with as many sycophants as he could. It meant that you had a large number of Tory MPs that were first of all pro-hard Brexit, but very pro-Boris Johnson as far as a lot of them were concerned. Boris Johnson had won them their seats. So that meant many of the MPs who knew Johnson was useless were no longer in Parliament. Third, there was no talent waiting in the wings. Like when Truss and Sunak emerged as the standout replacements, yeah, you know you're in trouble. So they obviously thought it made sense to wait a bit longer in the hope that Johnson might get better. You know, even when some Tory MPs were insisting that Johnson had to go, there were reports of other Tory MPs saying to them, but who are you going to replace him with? Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, do me a favour. But this is clearly not how some Tories see Johnson's leadership. They've forgotten, wiped their memories. They've created this mythos of a man who was made leader because he'd been making a good leader and was unfortunately ambushed by cake. And this failure to understand their own recent history is steering them wrong on their immediate future as well. Boris Johnson could well end up being more instrumental in the destruction of the Tory party than Nigel Farage. And they just don't see it. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.